So welcome, everybody. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the acting CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and we are thrilled today to have these incredible experts talking about this really important topic here in the United States. Before I introduce them and we get into this session, I just want to say a few things. So throughout the spring, starting today, and probably now into July, the AFP and our U.S. Peace, Justice, and Democracy Working Group is hosting a series of these weekly webinars. And the title of the whole entire series is Preventing and Reducing Conflict and Instability in the United States, and more importantly, shaping what comes next. So we'll be talking with leading peacebuilding and conflict prevention experts, donors, policymakers from across the country, and getting out of our comfort zone and reaching out to other networks as well, and those that have been working in the US to try to see where we can leverage our work and build a bigger network and constituency for this work. So that's really a lot of the goals of these weekly discussions. They're meant to also be very practical. We're not here to kind of just analyze the problem. We want to understand what's working in the US, what's not working in the US, what needs to be done from a policy perspective, what can we learn from the millions or the billions of dollars that have been spent overseas on some of these issues that many of us have been working on overseas. Because we have now known the United States is not exceptional. We have some of the same conflict drivers and conflict dynamics that other fragile states have had in the last decades. So today, our session is bringing a conflict analysis lens to the United States. It's meant to go beyond our top line talking points. AFP has also written a lot about this. We talk about economic inequality. We talk about backsliding in democracy. What do we mean by this? And how do we take, as much as we can, a scientific approach to this and unpacking some of those really key issues? Because we have to understand it and accept that we have a problem before we can actually start focusing in on what's the problem we're trying to solve. Later, the second session today will be on how corporations and businesses can be agents of peace. So we hope you stay with us for that session as well. But I want to get right into this session because we have some really, again, exceptional people. The first is Nealyn Parker. She's the co-director from Bridging Divides Initiatives at Princeton University. She's going to start off and give us an overview and unpack some of these issues. Nate Hagen is a program director for the Fund for Peace, the Fragile States Index. He's been working there for more than 15 years. If you don't know what the Fragile States Index is, I encourage you to take a look at it. And I've said this many times over the past few days. I never thought he and I would be sitting on a panel together talking about the United States and indicators, fragility indicators. So our next speaker is Shaylee Gupta Barnes. She's the policy director from the Poor People's Campaign. And we are thrilled that Shaylee and Monica Hemmerich, she's from the Ohio Poor People's Campaign, are here to talk about that economic inequality issue. What is driving that? And again, getting us out of our comfort zone of what we're used to, who we're talking to. Tim Phillips is also here with us. He's the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict. And their work is just brilliant. They're really trying to unpack this from a mental health, from a neuroscience perspective of why are we doing these things that we're doing, even not on a conscious level. So with that, I just want to thank everybody also who's tuning in. If this is your first time connecting with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, welcome. If you're a member or partner, we're glad you're here. And we hope that you connect more in with us, especially with the our US working group. We would love to have you there as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nealyn.
Liz, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for attending this. Thank you for your incredible work and your interest in this topic. My background is about 15 years working in post-conflict countries and then seeing triggers, red flags in the United States, coming back to work here. So what I thought I would do at the urging of Liz is a conflict analysis of the United States using the same methodology that we would have used for a country overseas. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if I could have a bit of a confirmation that you can see it. Perfect. Great. So as Liz said, the Bridging Divides Initiative is a nonpartisan research initiative based at Princeton University. We track political violence and political mobilization in hopes of preventing or mitigating it. The sort of standard conflict analysis structure, your context or profile, your causes or triggers, actors and dynamics. I'm going to switch a little bit around and put the dynamics in with the triggers. So let's go ahead in the interest of time and jump right in. In terms of the context, over the last 50 years, we've been in the longest period of international stability in the modern era. And I think this is a really important feature of what's happening globally, but also what's happening in the United States, because not only is the United States a member of this, but it's a leading member. So in this period, the United States has enjoyed a fairly remarkable period of political and economic stability, and also been a leader and a winner in this system. But that period of stability has also overseen a period of really dramatic change. In terms of what's happening within the United States, we are a country that has a long history of political violence. This is actually not the worst of it that we have seen in this country. And so in the question of, is what's happening new or not, the answer there has to be yes. There are things that are happening now that are distinct, but they also live in a context of centuries of political violence. Obviously the Civil War, but following that, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and in 2016 and 2018, we saw political violence also around our elections. As Liz mentioned, we also are a country where from World War II on, we've had rising inequality with some dramatic trends in the 1980s as well. The top 10% of families own 75% of household wealth, and the top 0.1% own as much as the bottom 90%. Structurally, that's not something that you would feel good about from a moral and economic perspective, but additionally from a political violence perspective, where there is so much inequality that can be problematic, but much more so in the context of economic shocks, where in fact everyone is losing a little piece of something in the context of that inequality. So in 2008, the Great Recession, the economic crash, and then subsequent Great Recession had bank bailouts, but there was really unequal economic recovery. And that, in the context of the already significant inequality, has had long-standing implications from a political violence perspective. In addition to that, we've had drops in some of the trust levels of the key institutions of democracy. So in government, in elections, in the security sector, in media, and in each other. In terms of government, in 2020, there was a Pew Research poll that said just 20% of US adults say that they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing, always or most of the time. Just 20% of the country. Decreased trust in the security sector. Confidence in our police force is at a 27-year low, according to a 2020 poll by Gallup. It fell to 48%, making the first time in the 27-year trend history that it was below a majority level. There's been decreased trust in information and the media. Again, if 48% was low, trust in social media is at an all-time low of 27%. Decreased trust in elections. And I think one of the features of many of these decreases in trust is that they are not partisan. Some of them have a partisan bent, but many of them have indicators from both the left and the right of why there is a decrease in trust, and decrease in trust in the elections is a good example, where on the right there is the movement of Stop the Steal and it is organized, but on the left there is a sense of long-standing and documented voter suppression. And for both of those reasons, the outcome of elections has been less trusted. And then finally, decreased trust in each other. This is the affective polarization that we've talked about. 57% of our own people think political polarization has gotten so extreme that they believe that the US is in the midst of a Cold War, according to the 2021 Edelman's Trust Barometer. So this is the context within which we have triggers. And I think the way to think about this is that you have the table that is set, and it's set over centuries, but then you find yourself in a period of higher risk when the trust gets significantly low. And I think we find ourselves in that period. And in that period, triggers that are happening all of the time have the potential to sort of spin into something larger. So in this case, we have had a pandemic, and the pandemic has psychological and reality effects that that make us at higher risk of violence or of contentious activity. So people being afraid and being motivated by fear, the urgency that we feel around needing to solve society's problems, the sort of like non-willingness to wait. When you are not in the midst of a crisis, you might have the ability to feel like you can wait for problems to be solved, less so in this context. We've also not resolved our racial and social injustice, and so we saw over this past year, and I'll get to this in a little bit, in 2020, there were three main motivators of political activity, and those were Black Lives Matter and then other racial and social justice, COVID-19 and pandemic-related mobilization, and election-related mobilization. There were other issues, but those three were consistently the main drivers. 44% of all mobilization in 2020 was related to Black Lives Matter alone. 20%, or just under, forgive me, I was being called by 911. Just under 20% of mobilization was related to COVID-19. And while elections were only 12% of mobilization overall for the year, in the period of the election, they, from the 11 weeks before to the 11 weeks after, they made up 27% of all that activity. So we went into an election already polarized in a context of higher concern. We went through that election, and I think it would be hard to argue that we are in a better place now from the perspective of risk of political violence than we were in before. There are some trends that are positive indicators, but almost all of the major indicators suggest that we have a higher risk, that we have lower trust in elections, lower trust in the security sector, lower trust in government, et cetera, than we had before the election. And then we have these three main motivators. So this is where I'll switch from a little bit some of the triggers to some of the dynamics. Looking at the nature of these mobilizations, they look different. Who is most likely to demonstrate around Black Lives Matter and racial justice is politically more likely to be on the left. The response is more likely to come from the right. The triggers are more likely to be police violence against unarmed Black and Brown Americans, Confederate statues or other symbols, and when they come down. And then in terms of where those dynamics might shift in 2021, unresolved court cases, unresolved issues around police violence and verdicts and anniversaries of particular dates. And of course, the Chauvin trial is one of the combining that with a shooting in Minneapolis is an indicator of where we might see greater risk. COVID is one that is across the political spectrum, and they have not had as much counter protesting. There are restrictions around COVID, wearing masks, etc., businesses being closed, school calendars, policy timelines, and other have been major drivers. And I think it remains to be seen what the next phase looks like, but certainly if there are new strains, school calendars, those are things to be watching out for. And then in the elections, while the election is over, there continue to be some very, very low level election activity. There also are upcoming elections in Virginia already, and across the country in 2022 and 2024. In this case, we would anticipate that there would be more demonstrating from the party that loses, and that was in fact the case in the elections. But there was an increase in paramilitary activity related to these elections that we might see going forward. It is not the only time that we've seen an increase in unlawful paramilitary activity. So here are total demonstrations on the y-axis, and over time. There is, of course, January 6th looms large in our minds in terms of political violence, but in terms of straight numbers of activity, there was more unlawful paramilitary activity around the Black Lives Matter protests. There have been more car rammings around Black Lives Matter and social and racial justice than there were around the election period. This is just looking at the increase in paramilitary activity prior to the election. There was no state that made it to 24% of their demonstrations having participants from unlawful paramilitary. Post-election, there were several who had reached that the level of 18% or higher. In addition to the mobilizers that we saw in 2020, there are others there are ways that energy is sort of moving into some other sectors. So the increase in hate incidents around AAPI is part of the pandemic. The energy around racial justice, as there are increasing activity around the border, we have seen some of that translate into immigration, into paramilitary moving to border patrols, et cetera, and the same actors who have participated in Stop the Steal have shown that they're also motivated by gun rights and Second Amendment. So to the extent that that becomes a policy issue that's a driver in 2021, we may see that move forward. There are many presentations that are following me, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the actors, but rather move into a more optimistic moment to close out, which is that there are, in fact, a number of things related to resilience that I haven't covered yet. So while there are a number of risks in the United States, there are thousands of organizations, and this is the bridgingdivides.princeton.edu map of 6,000 different organizations across the country that are working on bridging political, racial, and other divides. And you can, just for your awareness, should you want to look in your area, zoom in and connect to organizations that are working on issues that are important to you, but also see where that coincides with where there have been violent activities. The way that these 6,000 organizations work together can be sliced in lots of different ways, but there are those that are working on the kind of internal individual work, bringing two people together, bringing communities together within themselves or between those communities, working with the grass tops and the federal and the national. So I'm going to pause there because I happen to know a little bit about what's coming, and it's very, very good. But should there be any questions for me now or at the end, I'm happy to answer those.
So a couple of things. I didn't do great housekeeping at the beginning. Please, along the way, we want this to be a discussion. So if you, in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm monitoring it and we can ask questions along the way as well. Neelan, I do want you to go back though. Can you say a couple things about key actors? And I just also want to make it clear so people understand this. Resilience can be good or bad. It can be positive or negative. So authoritarian governments, for example, are very resilient, but I wouldn't necessarily say they were part of positive peace. And some of the structures we have in the US that are also negative, but are keeping things stable. So Neelan, can you just say a couple things about key actors?
Yeah, so let me say two things. One is that I am a bit of a person who rejects the notion of peace as our goal, but rather that what we're looking for is a sort of self-sustaining peace. And this is important when you look at, for example, January 20th and the transition of power from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. In Washington, D.C., this required a deployment of National Guard. It required, or at least had, checkpoints on many of its corners. It had the erection of walls around the Capitol building. In effect, the city became a police state, and the goal of what we are trying to achieve is not one in which there is the absence of violence and therefore an authoritarian or a police state, but rather one in which there is self-perpetuating peace, which I believe lives in the context of justice or a more just society. That doesn't mean that you don't take security precautions, but it does mean that as we are working together towards this objective, it would be a misalignment for us to think that what we are going for is those kinds of resilience that result in authoritarian government. Having said that, in terms of actors, I do think that that we saw a spike in this is not going to be news to people. We saw a spike in polarization around the elections. Political figures in the political elite play a significant role in our definition of self, and government officials as well. And again, that can be both positive and negative. I would cite on the positive in the Biden administration, his language of unity, while it has not kind of won over significant sectors of the country on either the left or the right, has certainly been meaningful to many, and also has taken away a talking point for recruitment in some of the extremist right and paramilitary sectors. And so you can see where political rhetoric by elected officials and by candidates does make a fairly direct difference. Liz, you had asked me to speak about actors before, and I hedge a little bit on that because I think that the actors are clear in some of the triggers. When the security sector or when law enforcement acts in ways that trigger violence, when there feels like there is no accountability on those fronts, that is a contribution. But my experience of this is that there are a vast number of interacting actors at all levels that are perpetuating this, and that efforts to pin this on one actor are actually quite misguided.
Okay, and I think that is a crucial point. What we hoped for, and it's exactly what you did, is to show that this is a complex system. There's not one thing that's driving this. There's not one actor. There's, and you have to look at it when I was at the U.S. government and we were developing these conflict analysis going back into the early 2000s, it's an equation. It's the conflict equation. Again, social science, not an exact science, but you had to look at the grievances, the resiliencies, both good and bad, that can push back on them. Key actors, both good and bad, and also what are those events that can trigger this? Because you have to look at all of that, and those trends going forward. So so I think that this is a really important piece, and you put it in a great context for us. Okay, so Nate, I'm going to you now. The Fragile States Index. Talk to us about how the US is looking at these indicators across the board.
Great, thank you so much. Very happy to be here with everyone. Great presentation, Neil, and thank you so much for that. So I'm sharing my screen here. Hope that you can all see it. So just to put it in a little bit broader context, what the FSI is, what it tries to do, what it doesn't do. The Fund for Peace has been around now for 60 years or so. And of course, 60 years ago during the Cold War, the whole field was very different, and the emphasis was on trying to prevent an escalation of violence between countries. And then around 9/11, there was kind of a light bulb moment, and everybody thought, well, actually, it's not so much about conflict between countries, it's about state failure. And so what that means is that it's not so much about balance of power, alliances, and international trade and other IR factors. In order to really get a handle on conflict mitigation and conflict management and prevention, what we had to do was really build up the state institutions in fragile states, because the thinking kind of was that those failed states over yonder are, conflict is emanating and instability is emanating from those failed states over yonder, which, we have to kind of keep away from our shores in some way. But over the last 5 years or so, the conversation has really begun to become more nuanced, I think led largely by the development community, saying that, well, it's not just about, state institutions, and it's not just about state failure, but we're talking about issues of fragility. We're talking about complex systems. We've got global pressures, and we have very hyper local pressures. And we're going to have to kind of rethink, what we're trying to do here. And, as in the Fund for Peace, trying to rethink. It's not just about, diagnosing, failed institutions, but rather trying to better understand the complex systems and dynamics and pressures that create sort of destabilizing dynamics. So we're looking at environmental pressures, we're looking at commodity prices, we're looking at sociology and identity and media consumption and all these other things that you've got to look at in order to really understand, the risk of violence, in today's globalized world. So we're talking, when we talk about drivers, we're talking about pressures and shocks. We're talking about compounding and cascading factors, cycles and feedback loops. This is not a sort of simple cause and effect relationships that can be easily parsed. It's a constantly sort of changing causal loop diagram, rather than kind of a linear if-then model. So we've been trying to build tools and methodologies to better frame this discussion more productively, not just as an abstract and sort of theoretical exercise, or for developing probabilistic models to forecast violence per se, but to better inform conflict sensitivity, risk management, peace building by communities, by private sector, by military, by government actors and other stakeholders. And so, trying to get our heads around the complexity and develop, tools and models that can more approximate, these highly complex dynamics. So it's not theoretical, it's not abstract, but when a global shock like COVID-19 strikes, and it's rare that you'll get one shock that strikes the entire world simultaneously, and that creates an opportunity to do sort of more of a comparative analysis. that doesn't often present itself. I think the last time on the FSI that this happened was in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So this does not happen very often. When it does, it forces you to rethink how you are going, how you're envisioning and modeling these things. So we've had to kind of rethink it. This is the Fragile States Index, the indicators that we use. We have some 90-some metrics that aggregate up to these 12 indicators. We've got political pressures, social and cross-cutting pressures, economic, and cohesion. And generally, when you're talking about a fragile state, generally you're talking about a state that is unable or unwilling to guarantee essential services to the population in an inclusive way, as well as security and safety for the population, and to sort of function as a sovereign entity on the international stage. That's what we normally think of when we think about a fragile state. And as such, unsurprisingly, you will have, countries like Somalia and Yemen who are red, in the alert stage. And then you have the United States, which is green, which is in the stable stage. And this, is a tool that, it's a model that sort of tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything, because what we've learned from COVID-19 is that there are some shocks that are actually even more dangerous for rich, highly globalized countries than poor, isolated countries. So, our sort of traditional ways of thinking about fragility versus not doesn't really help us understand or diagnose the types of risks and dynamics that can happen in a country like the United States. So we need to look below the surface of these top line indicators, and we certainly can't look at it in broad aggregate, except in as much as it's useful to state that the United States is not a fragile state, in the way that a Yemen or a Somalia is a fragile state. To the extent that that is useful, you can say it, but ultimately there's so much more nuance and dynamic that has to be, parsed. So we did a bunch of analysis on, and ran a bunch of regressions to try to sort of get our heads around some of these dynamics. And what we found two things. One is, not surprising perhaps, but interesting to validate quantitatively, is that there is a quantitative relationship between greater severity in COVID rates, sharp recession, and protests and violence. So you can draw those lines, and that was not too surprising, but it was still useful to be able to validate to the extent that the data was representative. And can be validated in this way. What was really interesting was when we then tried to look at which countries were able to prove more resilient than other countries. The hypothesis would have been that that countries with stronger health systems, or countries with higher GDP per capita, would have been more resilient in the face of this type of complex shock that cascaded across all these different social, economic, and political and security dimensions, right? But that's not the case. What actually seems to have been more predictive of resilience was social cohesion. Countries with more social cohesion tended to do better when it comes to this vicious cycle that you see on this slide here. So this brings us to the United States. If you look at the long-term trends, the National Geographic magazine, they did a bit of an analysis of the FSI scores over the last 10 years. And they saw that, in general, the majority of the countries, in the world sort of were drifting in a positive direction over the last 10 years overall. And there was a minority of countries which was drifting in the negative direction. So that, the United States being in the red, it's certainly, just looking at this slide alone, it's not a flashing red light, but it's certainly a warning sign that you would have this long-term trend, in that direction. Typically what happens is there will be a shock, and a country will worsen in one or two indicators, and then the next year afterwards, the subsequent year, it'll come back to the mean. So these long-term trends are to be noted. When you see a long-term drifting in the negative direction, that tells you that, possibly you need to look more deeply to see if there's something systemic, something sort of fundamental that needs to be looked at in terms of risk. When you look at the different groups of indicators in the United States, what you see is that the cohesion indicators have been worsening appreciably in the last 10 years. In fact, overall, the United States, I believe, is one of the most worsened when it comes to its cohesion indicators during this period. And we haven't released the scores yet for this last calendar year, but it certainly has continued apace in terms of a worsening. And in fact, it's compounded across multiple other indicators as well. So this idea that for resilience to even a health crisis like COVID-19, you need social cohesion in order for everyone to be able to make the shared, sacrifices necessary for the collective action necessary. The United States is becoming less and less resilient. And certainly we experienced that in 2020 with just the challenges that we faced trying to get our heads around that issue. And this is a bit, I think, a warning for us is that if we're looking at, economic indicators and even political stability indicators, and, as being sort of our diagnostic kind of, independent variables, if the economy comes roaring back in the next couple of years, and if, state legitimacy, is as strong as it ever was. But if at the same time, the social cohesion indicators continue to worsen, then we are going to continue to be in a worse place because eventually there will be a shock of some kind. That is, one thing is absolutely predictable. We don't know when, we don't know how bad, but there will be a shock. And we can't simply look at the economy and our institutions alone to tell us whether or not we're resilient. If we don't get our social cohesion, right, then we're gonna do worse next time when the shock hits. So I'll stop there.
Nate, thank you. That was fantastic. And again, it's putting this into this systems approach so that we can see the trends and compare ourselves to other countries and other countries that have been sliding up and down the scale. So thank you. We're going to come back to you because I have a gazillion questions, but Shali has a hard stop at 2. We're going to continue this session till 2:30, if that's okay with everybody, because there are so many questions popping up. But Shali, Nate set you up really well. He talked about if the economy comes roaring back, are we off the hook? He set this up perfectly for you.
Really did. And thank you, Liz, for organizing this panel and the series of discussions that the Alliance for Peacebuilding will be doing over the next several weeks. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm the policy director of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we also approach this idea of building a campaign that's rooted in addressing these interlocking injustices of systemic racism, of poverty, of ecological devastation, of militarism, and of these false narratives that hold these injustices in place, including, maybe most prominently Christian nationalism. So we're organized around these systemic injustices. And so, and we are very concerned, in fact, that the economy, even when it does recover, because it will start to recover, that it will recover in a way that continues to leave too many people out, and that and it won't recover in a way that reflects any of the lessons we should have learned over the past, not just the past year, but really the past, more than a decade from the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, where what the recovery that we saw was a low-wage, precarious recovery that left more and more people, that wiped out half the Black wealth in the country, and left us really as a nation, on the edge of austerity, on the edge of, implementing these measures that made it less and less likely for communities to have resources to be able to withstand the shock we're in now. So I wanted to say first that, as a national campaign, we're organized across 45 states. And our theory of change is that the only way we're ever going to address these injustices, including this deeply embedded economic inequality, is if we bring the people together who are most impacted by that inequality. So this is our strategy for building the kind of social cohesion that Nate talked about, for building the kind of resilience we need. It's our strategy for peace building, in fact. And it's not just rhetorical, it's not just in our words, but in our actions. We spend a lot of time and energy building an infrastructure, establishing systems that actually bring people together, both to take action together, nonviolent civil disobedience, but also to create art and music, to hear for and care for each other, to pray, to cry and mourn and laugh together. We are building something new that can cut through the divisions and silos that we're told we belong in. And at the center of this approach is this fact that there are, when we talk about economic inequality, we're talking about 140 million people, 40% of the country, that before any pandemic hit was poor or one emergency away from economic ruin, not just below the poverty line, but a health crisis, a family emergency, a parking ticket, any unexpected event in your life, from becoming, in some ways homeless in a matter of weeks. And so 40% of the country is not a marginal group. In fact, it's not any one singular group. If we disaggregate all of our information to the best that we can, given the available data, and when you look at that 140 million, it's 26 million, or 60% of Black people. It's over 60% of Latino people. That's 38 million people. It's 40% of Asian people. That's about 8 million Asian people. It's close to 60% of Indigenous and Native people, about 2 million. So that's in total about 74 million people of color, but then 66 million, or 1 out of every 3 white people. And, so we're talking about just tens and millions of people who are part of every state in the country, right? There's no geographic region that isn't touched by this degree of economic insecurity. And these people, this 140 million share common experiences of deprivation, but also common experiences of building survival systems, right? Whether it's sharing food stamps, rolling pennies and dimes so you can have your heat on in the winter, planting an extra row in the garden, or going house to house to collect for family in need. There are common experiences that resonate across race, across gender, across geography, across party lines, right? But it is in fact that they're still kept apart by our political system. They're kept apart by our economy. We're kept apart by institutionalized systemic racism in our jobs, in our home ownership, in our education. And ironically, we're brought together in the most violent and exploitative conditions, right? Through the military, through prison, through the low-wage workforce. So this campaign, what we're trying to do is build structures and spaces that bring this 140 million together peacefully, non-violently, to struggle together for what we all need. And this isn't easy. It is dangerous. Many of our people have been threatened and face, threats of violence on a regular basis, but it is powerful and it is possible, and we can build a deep solidarity from that basis. And we've seen it. So before the campaign was, the history of the campaign that brought us to where we are comes out of many different parts of the country, including in North Carolina, where we were seeing predominantly white chapters of the NAACP being formed in Appalachian parts of North Carolina, because neither political party would come to the needs of this community, but the NAACP and the Moral Mondays movement did. We've seen, former members of racist organizations live side by side with families of color in homeless encampments and have to protect their children together from sweeps. And from social services, ripping their families apart. We've seen it around low-wage worker organizing, where workers on and off the job are sharing childcare, they're sharing food stamps, they're sharing these systems that bring them together in this brutal solidarity that's necessary to confront the violence that is otherwise, otherwise devastating. And just this week, in fact, in our online digital event on Monday, we had a white naval veteran who grew up in a trailer park in Virginia, evangelical, found like a deep kinship with a single Black mom from the South Side of Chicago. Two people who everything tells us should be kept apart and can't actually work together. They will now, I know, having been in this campaign for years, fight for each other because the structure exists that has brought them together to do so. And so we call this fusion organizing. Fusion builds a power that's greater than its parts. It's deeply rooted in the history of this country and in the South. Some of you may know about the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War, where freed Black people came together with poor whites. Again, two people that were deliberately and brutally kept apart from each other to create their societies anew. They actually wrote Reconstruction constitutions that didn't just guarantee the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They guaranteed the rights to everybody, to the fruits of their own labor, to voting rights, to the rights of education. This is before the 15th Amendment. It's before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act. Transformative change that we never would have thought was possible, but the conditions were such that the common interests of these otherwise, pitted against populations compelled them to come together. And of course, there was backlash. As Neelan said, the violence we're seeing today isn't new. It has a history. Federal troops were pulled out of the South. The Reconstruction era was ended by vigilante, resurgence of violence, of white extremism. And that history has a lot to tell us today. The times we're in now, the kind of inequality, the kind of insecurity that we're seeing now on such a wide scale are compelling. They're creating the conditions for a new kind of unity to grow in a way that hasn't been possible for a long time. A unity based in this deeply polarized economy. And it's not a coincidence that this is now the conditions where we're seeing this resurgence of emboldened white supremacy, whether it's by the police or otherwise. And this doesn't mean we don't keep fighting for that unity. In fact, it makes our call for that even stronger. If we don't see the common basis for bringing these disparate populations together, then we're not bending we're not bending the arc of history towards justice. So we must bring those 66 million poor white people together with the 74 million poor people of color. Otherwise, we risk, as others have said, the even greater violence. And so this is what we're building across 45 states. It is having an impact on narrative, on policies, on elections. And that's what we're all about. And I'm really happy to hear that, happy to have Monica here from Ohio, who's a leader in the Ohio Poor People's Campaign, who can speak to what this looks like, what the conditions are on the ground in Ohio, what they're building there, how that's connected to the rest of the country, and the kind of people who are holding this campaign every day and really, building a new and unsettling force that eventually is going to, be what can ensure that we can not just survive but thrive as we all must.
Thank you, Shali. That was powerful. And you're putting it into perspective. I was taking notes feverishly while you were talking. People have been kept apart by structural racism, politics, but they're brought together in the most violent places like prisons and the military. That that's pretty powerful, and I think says a lot about what we're dealing with. I know you have a hard stop at 2, so you'll have to go, but Monica will be here. She'll wrap us up, and she'll be here to take questions. This isn't the end of the conversation we're going to have with you, because I think your campaign has some of the best understanding of what's happening, and more importantly, what to do about it. And that's the key to all of this. So I can't thank you enough. And also looking at the signs that are behind you: fight poverty, not the poor, and don't pit people against each other, because that's what we're really good at doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Tim, I need you to put this all into perspective. You and I have had many, many conversations on this. Seems obvious, right? What's going on in our brains? Why is this hard? What is happening? What is driving people to this?
Well, thank you. When asked that question, I always have to tell people I'm not a scientist, but I spend time with a lot of smart scientists. After hearing this conversation, and thank you for this invitation, I wanted to sort of bring 2 sort of frames, one from practice and one from science. And if you don't mind, I'll start with the practice, because for 25 years, Beyond Conflict, we worked in many countries around the world using this sort of model of shared experience, meaning what we brought to the table were the experiences of people who never imagined changed in their own context, or who could never imagine sitting across the table from their enemy, and yet over time found a way to humanize the other and actually engage and actually find a way forward. And it was a very powerful journey for them, and they really learned when it's modeled from others. And so in the last year in particular, I've been reaching out to a lot of these individuals around the world who I've really learned from, and asked them to reflect at this moment in the United States. And it struck me that it's really, I think, key to the conversation started by Neil and then Nate, in terms of how we do an analysis of the conflict, how do we frame it, how do we think of it from a systems point of view. And one thing that's very clear is we have to be clear about what is the issue we're addressing in this country. You know, for a lot of folks like us who do work in peace building, conflict resolution internationally from the United States, we're now bringing it home to our own country where we don't have that emotional distance. And it's a very different kettle of fish. And we need to recognize that we have to have the perspective, which is difficult when it's your own country and community, that we would bring to other countries to do that more almost sort of, I don't want to say neutral conflict analysis. And I see in a lot of conversations, people are getting confused or tripped up or uncertain about, you know, should we have dialogue when some profound issues are at stake? And what I hear from people outside who've been involved in really important transitions, they say you need to know the difference between dialogue around issues like a community health center, or a nuclear power plant in your community, or, you know, X, Y, and Z issue, which can be very emotionally based, very important, very key to issues of justice and equality and opportunity. But then there's the conversation around resolving a conflict that is a sense where a peace process steps in. And I think it's really important that we step back and ask, what are we trying to address at a national and local level in this country? I think, as Nate and Neelan pointed out, not only are we becoming more fragile as a country, we're in a conflict zone. And therefore, it's really important to recognize that when you have certain conversations, that we're really, in a sense, talking about a peace process. And some of the lessons, you know, from abroad is, when you do a peace process, you can't choose who you negotiate with. You have to recognize that there are some profound issues at stake, that you may not get the clarity you want. You may be sitting across the table from people who have profoundly different views. They may represent things that are a violation of some core values that you and your family have held. You may have seen things over the last 4 years, the last year or two, that really violate some really profound sacred values, so to speak. And how could you ever imagine sitting across the table? And I think when we look abroad, which is really important, the lessons from people who are trying to bridge profound divides, whether it was trying to end apartheid, or look what's happening in Northern right now with the Good Friday Agreement, or the Salvadoran peace process, or Dayton. Richard Holbrooke used to say, I am not in the human rights community. I am trying to resolve conflict and end the violence. And I remember working in the late 80s and 90s in different conflict zones. We had to be very clear what our brief was, what our mandate was. Are we in the human rights community and we know what our brief is? Or are we in the conflict resolving space? And what's the brief there? And I think that's getting mixed up here in this country, particularly since so many of us in the peace building conflict resolution community who are looking internally, we're also caught up in that because we feel immense connection to the challenge. And we see ourselves on different sides of this. And that's some of the feedback that I'm getting from people internationally, is they're saying, know what you're addressing. You really have to have an understanding of what it is you're trying to resolve. That you shouldn't confuse social justice with peace building. Social justice has its own brief, has its own mandate. And many social justice activism is about polarization to some extent, because that's a way you activate people, you get attention. Whereas a lot of the counterpolarization work that we've heard discussed in other venues is about actually getting people to reduce that tension, reduce that polarization. And I see that they're cross-cutting and becoming very tense with each other, because we need to unpack and say, what is the conflict we're dealing with? How do we approach it? What are the frames we use? Who do we talk to? Who do we not talk to? Under what conditions? Is it dialogue? Is it the equivalent of a peace process? And so I think we need to unpack that more. And I think we need to avoid a lot of the binaries too, what I hear, when we think about the issues we're dealing with here. But then what does science tell us, right? So one, science tells us it's really, we know this empirically, it's important not to essentialize the other. So one of my colleagues who passed away, many of you will know, Emile Bruneau, a few years ago was doing some work with us on how to unpack Islamophobia in the United States. And one of the issues was, okay, when there's a negative stereotype against an outgroup, in this sense, not the majority population, collective blame comes on. So how do you address that? And in the research which he did, which is really powerful, is when he took a group of white Americans, white Christian Americans in this case, and would ask the question, should all white Christian Americans be responsible for what Timothy McVeigh did in Oklahoma City? Their automatic response in milliseconds is no, he doesn't represent our group. Okay, should all white Christians be responsible for Dylann Roof? And the response was no, he doesn't represent our group. And then what he was doing was teeing up context in those brains. And then he introduced an image of a young woman from Jordan, Amina, and say, should she be responsible for what happened on 9/11? And they paused and said, no. Well, what about Muhammad here in Morocco? Should he be responsible for what happened in Orlando? No. And literally what was happening, what he was testing, is that once you teed up context, where unconsciously, organically, they made a distinction in their own community between collective blame and individual action, then their brains essentially were processing it would be hypocritical to do that to these people in the outgroup. And then followed up in Spain and the United States. And in Spain found that when he followed up with them 4 times over 1 year, that 10-minute intervention lasted, where when they were given petitions against Muslim immigration or other anti-Muslim policies, they said no. And I give this because one of the key takeaways is in some of the surveys, after people said no, this person shouldn't be held responsible, he then would ask, well, or say, you realize you were being hypocritical. And then they would contract and pull back and feel shamed and stigmatized. And there was no benefit. And the point in that, and there are other studies, is that we need to avoid in this moment in the United States, which we know empirically from experience, but I think the research is also showing that we have to be really careful, as difficult as it is, when some profound values are at stake, is how we frame and communicate to people across divides, to avoid calling out people's hypocrisy, to avoid essentializing, to avoid collective blame. And, you know, one of the things that Neelan said early, looking at economic inequality. So after the November election, I turned to some of my colleagues within Beyond Conflict and said, you know, that has to be obviously one of the key drivers. And what's really interesting in some of the research in brain and behavioral science and social psychology, status threat is a real driver here. And here's what's interesting about status threat. It actually has a biological basis in all humans. We're wired for survival. We're wired to be aware of threats to our status. But when legitimate, biologically experienced concern about one's status gets weaponized as grievance, gets turned into outrage and anger, and then becomes toxic polarization, then it becomes much more difficult to unpack that. And so, for example, what I love in the Poor People's Campaign, but one of the things that I think it's really important to recognize is that, you know, for 66 million Americans, white Americans, who also are struggling with poverty and injustice, in a hyper-polarized environment where identity, us versus them, is really most obvious and present, which identity becomes more important to that group at that time? And if there are people driving that white identity, that can often become more salient. And I remember 25 years ago, Tom Frank wrote a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, which had a long history of populism in the early 20th century. And the notion was that that economic solidarity, in a sense, would carry. And I think we need, and this is why we went to science, to really understand if those identities, which are core to how we operate in the world as humans, which become more salient, particularly at certain periods when there's increasing political pressure and where these bonds of identity become much more important to people in terms of defining who's in your group, who's out of your group. And, you know, one of the things I'll also mention is not only about essentializing. So one of the core things I mentioned about status threat, it's very clear that threats to one's status, even in the majority, is becoming a more relevant issue that we have to address as a nation. And what's really compelling and important and difficult to navigate is even talking about it as status threat can cause a negative response. Because it's like, are you essentializing us? Are you saying we all think the same way? Are you saying that we are defensive? Sort of goes back to Emil's research on Islamophobia. To call out people's hypocrisy literally came a response of stigma, shame, and whatever benefit could have been gained was lost. And so we need to understand those sort of cognitive dynamics of what it is to be human that are particularly enhanced in hyperpolarized identity-based environments. And, you know, so that's part of what we've been trying to do in our research. And the other thing which ties to some of the shared international experience is looking inward and being very clear about what it is we're trying to address and not try to lump everybody together. And I think we've all seen that people working on social justice and now being connected to people working on peace building, or, you know, how do we deal with our past? And I think we need to be very clear, is what I see and hear, to have people recognize what their mandates are and where they could be in cooperation or where they could undermine each other's and water down the work that needs to be done. So maybe I'll just leave it there, Liz, so we can get to Q&A, but I just wanted to mention that. And you know, to your earlier question about the brain, you know, what got me interested in brain and behavioral science was when about 12 years ago, I was teaching a course at a local university on conflict transformation in the 21st century. I had Jerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland, who is a leader of Sinn Féin, and won't say it publicly, but very much in the IRA. And a student asked, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have tried to kill you? And his response was, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, there's a lot of brain and behavioral science behind these themes of humiliation, fear, and empathy. And when I quizzed him from the brain science point of view, he said something I think that's really relevant at this moment as a nation. He said, you know, speaking as a scientist, we're not rational beings with emotions. In fact, it's just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only truly think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see ourselves, are understood and valued by others. And so you can see that consistently around the world. And one of the key things that's at the core of this is the shared experience of exclusion. So Monica, in the work of the People's Campaign, you know, what we've seen empirically in other places is when the shared experience of feeling marginalized, of feeling excluded, of being denied dignity, of being humiliated, can be cross-cutting. And we need to find ways that sort of really override what are really evolutionary in-group brain processes. But we can do that. The brain is plastic and malleable. And we have to counter the forces that are at play. Not only do we have structural racism and really systemic inequality, we also have structural polarization in this country. It has become structural in the way it's playing out. And so maybe I'll just leave it at that for now, Liz, and look forward to the conversation.
No, absolutely. And I think I think I said this to you the other day. If people haven't seen it, take a look at the University of Chicago data that just came out on who stormed the Capitol. And it is people from counties where Biden won. It is people that are not poor. In fact, business owners, accountants, but they were from counties where they had seen the biggest change in demographics. So that data just came out from the University of Chicago. Tim, you're looking, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I read it, and it just reinforces even Thomas Edsel in the New York Times the other day. And it's one of the issues we're looking at. From how do we understand status threat, identity threat? How do we, you know, I have to say I agree totally with Neelan's point earlier, which I wanted to mention. Is peace the goal, or is a more inclusive representative democracy the goal? And, you know, we have to keep in mind is peace building is where there's been a state that's been fractured, fragmented, or broken. And peace is sort of a stop in between, hopefully to something more. I mean, even the most robust democracies, I think everybody on this call today knows, you know, conflict is inherent, both in human nature, certainly in democracies. The question is how we manage it.
That's right.
So when there's interruption to a conflict dynamic democracy, which is, I guess, a redundancy, you know, we can't lose sight. That's the point about being clear, not only about dialogue versus a peace process, and who you can talk with and at what point, how do you frame it? But also that peace is not the end goal. I mean, you want it, but you want that in a positive peace. And the way we think about it is the North Star is democracy. And how do we address these pressures and social divisions that are really tearing it apart? And if we don't understand that, and where the science is also helpful is reinforcing what I think we know intuitively about the human experience. People want to be understood. People don't want to be essentialized. And you know what's really interesting? People who are historically marginalized really resist the phrase victimhood. Mm-hmm. On the other side, people who maybe come from positions of power or majority communities don't want to be essentialized, because to be called a victim or to be sort of handicapped by victimhood is a form of essentializing anyways. So I think we just need to really understand how we frame this is going to be really key.
Okay, Monica, bring us home. There's some questions in the chat. We're going to go till 2:30 on this, but Monica, bring us home and maybe a little bit longer. Monica, bring us home on how is this playing out in Ohio? Where Ohio goes, so goes the nation.
Sure. Thank you for inviting the Ohio Poor People's Campaign to participate in this. I know that Ohio has friends and family all over the country, and you're always welcome back home. Shally had mentioned these statistics nationally, and there are poor and low income people in every state. And the statistics in Ohio parallel the national statistics. Before the pandemic, we had about 34% of our population considered as poor or low income. That would have been 48% of children, 40% of women, 61% of Black people, and in Ohio that amounts to about 860,000, 59% of Latinos, about 256,000, and then 33% of white people, which is 2.9 million. The minimum wage in Ohio is $8.55. What that means is about 74 working hours to be able to afford 74 working hours in a week to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And the living wage would be more accurately to say about $24 an hour. Before the pandemic, we had about 45% of our population earning less than $15 an hour. And since the pandemic, at least 45% of our population has lost some form of income. Finally, I did want to mention that in Ohio before COVID, diseases of despair was the 6th most cause of death in Ohio. So that is substance overdose, suicide, and alcohol-related cirrhosis of the liver. And since the pandemic started, at least 4 out of 10 Ohioans report symptoms of depression. And then of course, with everything else, the poor and low income feel it worse. And so it's 6 out of 10 for poor and low income people. So that's what's happening in Ohio, what it's like here. And I can say for the Ohio Poor People's Campaign, one of the things that makes us different is we are just regular people. We are friends, neighbors, family members who are coming together across these societal divisions to build something, to believe in change, something larger than ourselves. In our campaign in Ohio, some of the things that we've done since the pandemic, we hold a weekly open format Zoom call. So people who are home alone, isolated, can call in and find community, find someone to talk to. And sometimes these conversations get really, really deep because there's a lot of people who are struggling. Sometimes we just share music videos and sing and dance and laugh together. We've held story circles so that we can build storytellers and narrators, because for the campaign, it's about changing the narrative by changing the narrators. We have had political education events to teach just regular folks. We're not talking about activists here, people new to this sphere about nonviolence, principles of nonviolence. And we have invited activists to come in and make those bridges. We've organized actions at the state capitol, bringing narrators of impacted folks to find their voice, to sing together, and chant and march. And right now, currently, we have a trauma-informed peer support aid training taking place so that we can help each other. And, when Tim was talking about framing, in Ohio, we refer to ourselves as the Ohio Poor People's Campaign family. And that's how we frame it because, in your family, you're gonna have differences, disagreements, it happens. But at the end of the day, in our campaign, everybody's in, nobody's out. And I'd be happy to share stories about some of the leaders in our campaign and, where they've come from and what they're doing now.
Monica, I love that. In our campaign, in our family, nobody's out.
Yeah.
And that's a really important piece to this. I'm going to go to questions. We've had a couple come in. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I completely understand one of them, but Tim, I think it was you were talking about human rights versus peace building. You got some traction or you got some comments on the chat about that.
Yeah. I saw that and I wanted to respond. And thanks for clarifying. When I started doing this work, it didn't have so many descriptions of the work, right? So when I think of classic conflict resolution, of trying to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement, to negotiate the Dayton Peace Accords. That's very different, and I should have made that distinction, from peace building, where human rights and social justice is absolutely core to that. And that's, I guess, the point is to know there's a distinction between peace building, in a sense, classic conflict resolution, but knowing the brief, right? What is it you're actually addressing? And what is the frame for how you address it? And what are the ground rules for that? But I would agree that, and I'm glad she pointed that out, because that was a mistake in my framing.
But you're absolutely right. It doesn't, any place I have worked, Nepal, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, on peace processes or in the human rights, it comes up. There is a, how can you just sweep that under the rug and move on? So there is that tension there. Nate, you wanted to say something? Just jump in.
Just to kind of piggyback on that, I was in Nigeria doing a conflict assessment workshop, and we brought together the interfaith community representatives with the human rights lawyers, and they had very different approaches to the challenge. And in fact, there was conflict between the two of them, between the two cohorts, as to how to go about framing the problem and what kinds of mitigating options would come out of the analysis and so forth. But they were both obviously critical for diagnostics, to really kind of understand the deep sort of structural issues and the complexity. And so it was very helpful to have both cohorts at the table, but the tension between the two was very real and even, I think, productive as well.
Yeah, and holding each other accountable. You can have, and so I think that's really important as well. There was one question that came in about, I'm not 100% sure if I understand it, but Black Lives Matter protests in Oregon, those visuals really pushed the counter narrative of Trump supporters. Did someone see that question? I'm not 100% sure what the question is, but I don't know if somebody wants to say something about that.
I think I typed an insufficient answer to that one, so I'm happy to say something that maybe is a little bit more there, which is that that is correct. There were images of violence around in the early days of Black Lives Matter that set off a narrative of sort of national cities are burning. We need to have a strong posture to respond to this security wise and politically. It was part of a political mobilization moving into the 2020 elections, and those images were a big driver, I think, of the ultimately misunderstanding of Black Lives Matter protests being very violent, and BDI was part of a group of research that looked at even contention of any kind around protests, and they've been pretty consistently including in that moment 93 and above % peaceful. So the vast majority of all political mobilization, even very mobilized Americans, is very peaceful in this country. But nonetheless, those early images, I think, had a really profound psychological effect. And it is the case that even very isolated violent events have one of the outsized effects of those events is that they become counter mobilizers. And so one of the things that I think many of you well know is that efforts to just have protesters in separate locations so that there's not an opportunity for physical contact is one way to continue to allow and reinforce freedom of speech, and also reduce the possibility of violence. But I actually thought, is it possible for Dana to ask the question so that I understood what we understood
if
better?
she's still there, can you type the question a little bit more clear?
But she's got to type it. That's
yeah,
nice.
we can't hear her. But one of the things I wanted to ask, if we'll wait and see if she retypes it, but we'll also reach out to her and ask what it is. I wanted to ask you all a question. On Jimmy Kimmel, I saw, see, this is, and it was a joke. On Jimmy Kimmel, late night comedian, he pointed out that in US News and World Report, the US was rated this yesterday, rated the 6th best country in the world. Canada's #1, and we moved up 2 spots. I guess we were number 8 last year. This was a joke on late night TV. He's like, well, just ignore the insurrection that happened. And why does that, after everything we just said, everything we've been talking about, how does that happen? Anybody? I mean, I'm stumped, but anybody? I mean, in terms of, you know, is it just that, you know, we feel we can gloss over all these things as long as the economy's, I mean, I don't know. I'm just asking the question. Monica?
You know, my guess is that our poor and low income are invisible. You know, for the most part, we don't even acknowledge that it exists. And it makes me think of a conversation I had with my host mother when I was in Colombia. And, you know, she asked me, do you even know what a poor family is? You know, and how do I explain to her, you know, the village that I grew up in Ohio, where, you know, there are thousands of poor families, you know, we don't acknowledge that it exists here. And so, you know, when you talk about US exceptionalism, that message doesn't come across.
And I think that goes back to Tim, was it, or somebody's point of, oh, I think it was Shali. If the economy comes roaring back, then we're all good. But, you know, below the surface, the problems are very deep. Tim?
Yeah, I just was looking at some of the questions, and I think it's important, at least for me, to clarify, as we bring the lens of the work, which has been mostly international, home to the United States. And I do think it's important to recognize that a lot of these are interconnected, but some of the work that needs to be done has a distinct purpose, right? So social justice activism has its own mandate and very important work and clear way of doing that work. If your job is to resolve a violent insurrection or violent conflict or something that's really fragmented with the risk of real violence or current, you know, you're trying to end apartheid, right? You're trying to negotiate the Dayton Peace Accords. I mean, that's a very different process. It has different characteristics. Peace building, which is in that longer term sort of frame. I mean, it is at the core about building systems of justice and dignity and democracy. We don't do peace building to build an authoritarian state, right? We do peace building to build democracies that work, that are representative, that are built on inclusion and justice, right? And so I think it's important, though, particularly as we bring this work to the United States, that we understand that a lot of these, and some are more connected than others, but there are different lanes for different work. And what I've been seeing happening in the last several months is there's been so, I mean, I feel it, outraged by the intensity of the polarization that's happening in this country. It's very difficult, and I've experienced it myself, to imagine even having a dialogue with certain people. And I'm like, I spent my life doing this stuff. And it's really important to step back and say, how do we frame this? So people feel like they're not violating each other's space. But it's absolutely certain. And even on the issue of dealing with our past, there was a question about intergenerational trauma. I mean, when you think of restorative justice and transitional justice, that's certainly part of peace building. And often those things get put on the table during the resolution of a conflict or a transition, so to speak, in other countries. But we're in a different moment. We're, in theory, a mature democracy that's slipping back, that needs to deal with its past. And it's, so we don't have to, I mean, I would say reconciling our history is probably more of mandate the necessary reconciling our country, because you really can't reconcile until you know where you're coming from and where are we going. And I think we have to be able to really sit back and think about these real challenges, because there are competing issues here. You know, a lot of the 350 organizations that Neelan pointed out that are trying to promote dialogue are really trying to reduce polarization. And yet there are other strategies that polarization is part of getting people's attention. But where does that then increase the resistance to the change you want to make?
And when does it increase polarization? Dialogue. And that's a real key piece.
Yeah,
when are you doing harm?
And it's really, and I think it's really, that's really important. And this is not just me. When I've reached out to people with real experience across these different divides in other countries, when they look in, they have, you know, they're like, this is really important to define this. And I just wanted to add that, but we definitely, you know, we have a decline in our democracy, deepening identity-based polarization, and the urgent need to deal with our past. And when I think of a great Gauguin painting of these Tahitian women where he wrote in French, who are we, where are we from, and where are we going? And I think that applies to this nation. And I think some clarity about the issues and how we're framing it and how we're approaching it is going to be really important.
Thank you. And on that, Tim, we're going to end there. This is not the end. We're going to be pulling these themes throughout this series that'll run through June, July. So many of you will be coming back to talk about different issues. We're going to end this session here, and we're going quickly into the corporation section of how can corporations be change agents for peace, or you know, or not. So that's, you know, where we're going to go next. Again, I just want to thank each and every one of you. You guys were phenomenal, as always. And for trying to bring some clarity around this, one of the things came in is, this seems pretty elite, and that, you know, you have to have a PhD in this stuff. No, what we need is scientists, folks with PhD, analysis, people on the ground doing the work, regular people to come together and understand what the issues are, how to use this data for policy, how to make sure that we're actually solving the problem and not making it worse. So this and these series are how do we turn this information and data into good policy, into good practice. So again, I can't thank you guys enough. And we'll talk soon. Now we're going to turn to our next session with three, I think, excellent people to talk about this subject. Corporations, agents of peace in the United States. They play an incredible role in our society. How do we harness that, or can we, or do we not? So the second part of our session is how corporations and business can be agents of peace. We have Jenny Vaughn, who's the Human Rights Director for Businesses for Social Responsibility. Many of you know, or if you don't know, Jenny has worked internationally, worked for Mercy Corps, is very well known in the peace building field, and called me up a couple of months ago and said, how do we connect this? How do we work on this? So she's going to go through some of those challenges and opportunities. Alan Fitz is the Executive Director of International Government Relations at JP Morgan and Chase & Co. He is also a sits on our board of directors for the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And Angela Baker, who is the head of corporate responsibility for Qualcomm. So we're going to walk through this issue. Jenny, can you start us off and talk to us a little bit about the challenges, the opportunities, some of the risks? Where does all of this fit in?
Sure, and thanks so much, Liz. It's such a pleasure for me to be back in what feels like my native lands of peace building for a while. So I'm going to just talk through a bit about the language that I think is useful to talk to companies about peace, and it is a human rights language, so an interesting counterpoint, I think, to some of the discussion that's already arisen. And then I'd like to talk through some of the ways that companies can promote peace in the US, why they're not already doing this, what are some of the risks and the challenges that they're facing. And then I want to talk a little bit about how other actors, policymakers, civil society, donors can partner with business to promote peace. But let me start by just explaining a little bit about who BSR is. So BSR stands for Business for Social Responsibility. And we are a network of sustainable business experts that works with companies on a range of issues that fall under the rubric of what was formerly called corporate social responsibility, CSR, and is now much more commonly called sustainability. And so those issues include things like human rights, climate, equity and inclusion, inclusive economic growth, supply chains, and others. One thing that's interesting about BSR is we are kind of like a nonprofit consulting firm. We're mission driven. So we aim to work with business to promote a just and sustainable world. We believe that the role of business is to create and deliver products and services in a way that treats people fairly and within the boundaries of our planet. We are also a membership organization. So we have about 250 members, many of whom are well-known multinational corporations. You can actually find our membership list on our website, bsr.org. But we work across a range of industries, financial services. So we have members like Bank of America. We work with extractives like Shell and Chevron, as well as mining companies like Rio Tinto. We work with tech, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and a range of other well-known companies, Disney, Coca-Cola, Unilever, and many others. The way that we work with companies, we really see ourselves as a critical friend and as an extended member of those teams that are working on sustainability and human rights issues. So we provide research and insights, we provide advisory services, consulting projects, and we also facilitate collective action and peer-to-peer learning amongst companies. So it's been very interesting for me to move from the peace building and development space to what is called the business and human rights and sustainability space over the last couple of years. And I'll say right off the bat that one of the reasons I moved over into this field was, I think, my interest in working with companies to address drivers of conflict, and particularly the economic drivers that companies are naturally acting upon through their day-to-day operations. So one of the things that I've learned a lot about is how we can talk to companies about these issues of peace and conflict. And put more simply, I've come to think of this as, how do we talk to companies about their impact on society and about how to avoid doing harm? I would really see peace and human rights as different parts of the elephant. These worlds are quite siloed, but I see them as working towards quite common outcomes. So for the purposes of talking with business about these issues, the language is really one of human rights. And I think that is partly due to the fact that getting companies to think about these issues grew out of international human rights law. It operates very much from a legal framework. Human rights, of course, are inherent to all human beings. They're grounded in the International Bill of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and core international covenants. And they include things like bodily integrity rights, so right to life and security of the person. They include basic needs like the right to food, to water, to health, to jobs. And they include civil liberties like freedom of expression and the right to political participation. So for business, the business and human rights framework is best articulated by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So this is a document that was accepted and unanimously approved by the Human Rights Commission, Human Rights Council about 10 years ago. And it has broad multi-stakeholder acceptance. And I want to emphasize that point because I've been in a number of conversations that are, I think, aiming to bring together peace and human rights that have questioned the utility of the UN guiding principles and the business and human rights framework. I have come to the point of view where I accept the fact that this is the language that companies use. I do believe that we need to meet companies where they are, use their language to talk about these issues, and find ways of integrating peace building into the ways that they're doing business. So the business and human rights framework gives us a framework for layering in these other concepts. It is a voluntary framework that's changing a little bit because there's increasing regulation that mandates human rights compliance, but there's a lot of other levers that we can all act upon to get companies to respect human rights. And that's really the expectation that's laid out in the UN guiding principles, that companies will respect human rights. That means they will avoid infringing on people's rights and causing harm, and that they will remediate any harms that they are involved with. So there's a number of consequences that businesses face if they don't do that. And these are the things that we can be thinking about acting upon in the larger ecosystem if we want to influence the behavior of companies. So reputational risk is a big thing. Getting smeared in the media, being the focus of name and shame campaigns, that is something that companies want to avoid. Legal liabilities and the financial penalties that can come along with that. And then of course, there can be financial costs when there are delays or interrupted operations. So even though this business and human rights framework laid out by the UN guiding principles is voluntary, there are reasons, of course, why companies would want to act in a way and be seen to be acting in a way that respects rights. So let's talk a little bit about the role of companies in building peace. What can they do? And I just want to say right off the bat that my own bias in peace building has always been for prevention. So I like to identify what I consider to be the root causes of conflict and then find pragmatic ways to address those drivers. So I want to start a discussion about what companies can do to prevent conflict and to promote peace and stability in the US by thinking about some of those drivers. So this is not a conflict analysis. You've just had a very robust discussion about this, but I do just want to highlight a couple of the dynamics that I see as relevant and that companies can act upon. So there's three things I want to highlight. One, of course, is social media and its role in polarizing narratives and then incubating grievances. And it does this through the spread of hate speech, through mis and disinformation, and by enabling the growth of radically different worldviews in these social media bubbles, which I think have really served as that forum for incubating grievances. The second dynamic is our politics. There's become increased political polarization, meaning the movement of many elected Democrats and Republicans to the extremes, and of course, many people just in the general population as well. It includes the role of money in our political system, the way in which Citizen United has allowed companies to make political contributions. And then, of course, there's been the erosion of democratic norms and institutions. The third dynamic that I want to highlight is economic grievances. And this came up in the earlier discussion, this conversation about status threats, about the gap between expectations and reality, grievances related to loss of opportunity, to concerns about who's being left behind by the economic transformation that is our society is undergoing. So that's something, of course, that began a couple of decades ago with globalization, and it continues today with automation, the digital transformation, and the energy transition. So how can companies address these factors? I just want to touch briefly on a few things. First, I want to mention philanthropic initiatives, mostly to say that I'm not going to touch on that. Philanthropy has its place, but the business and human rights framework really requires that efforts to prevent and mitigate harm to people are integrated into the way that the company operates. And that's actually consistent with conflict sensitivity principles for international aid. So thinking about things like who you hire and how you procure goods and services, how and where you site your operations. That's what I mean by integrating into operations. So how can then companies address some of those drivers I highlighted in their operations? So taking them in turn. Social media, of course, this is predominantly the domain of the social media platform companies. So YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. And companies like that are acting in order to develop content governance policies and developing strategies, both algorithmic and human-led, for identifying and then removing harmful content. So content that spreads hate speech, content that is mis or disinformation. That third bucket of, or sorry, the second bucket of the political issues. There's a number of examples, and I think that probably Alan will be touching on this some, of companies, particularly in recent years, increasingly playing a political role in terms of advocacy or thinking about the impact of their political contributions. So we're seeing right now, for example, a number of companies making collective statements against the recent voter restriction laws in Georgia. And of course, we saw companies, including, for example, the National Association of Manufacturers, issuing a statement condemning the January 6th Capitol siege. And we've seen a number of companies in the long slog between election day and the designation of a new president. We saw a number of companies pausing their political contributions and really questioning whether they wanted to contribute to politicians who are blocking what is the functioning of our democracy. So then the third way in which companies can address conflict drivers is really cross-cutting. So this is something that any company can be doing, and it is those economic drivers. So how are companies operating, particularly in rural areas? How are they providing jobs, particularly for those who might be left behind? There's a number of initiatives and programs that companies are already doing that have the potential to address this. So I want to highlight that companies are doing things relevant to addressing these dynamics. I don't know that they're doing them intentionally in order to reduce the rise of extremism in the US. So that's kind of a link that can be better strengthened. But some of the programs that are being undertaken are things like ensuring payment of living wages, ensuring pay equity. It's things like workforce development, so providing training to those whose jobs are disappearing, either due to the digital transition, the energy transition, or automation. And then it's also developing leave and insurance provisions that would act as safety nets. So things that would enable workers and their families to overcome emergencies and shocks like COVID, for example. So why aren't companies already acting in a way that promotes peace? What are some of the constraints, in other words? I think it's easy for us from the outside to think that companies are willfully contributing to conflict or that they're intentionally not promoting peace. I think in many cases, there's constraints that keep them from doing this effectively. Companies, of course, have a reason to care about peace and stability. Business, at the very least, requires stability in order to be successful. So I just want to highlight a couple of the constraints that I've observed and then get into what this means for all of us who are working with and around business. So one issue is that companies are constrained by the economic system that we are all embedded in. So we still operate in an economic system where a company's primary duty is to its shareholders. They have to consider their financial health. They have to deliver on profits. If they don't do so, they risk being removed. We recently saw that actually with Danone's executive, he had tried to take the company in a more progressive direction, and he was removed just recently by shareholders. So that focus on financial performance on an annual basis really disincentivizes companies from looking at long-term trends that leads to very short-term decision-making. Second thing, there is a real lack of understanding amongst many companies of the link between context and the harm that a company can do. And I have to be honest, this was kind of surprising to me because I, of course, came from a field, development and peace building, where we've been steeped in these principles of do no harm and conflict sensitivity for decades at this point. So we know the importance of knowing your context, analyzing the impact of your organization on the context, and then taking action to avoid exacerbating dynamics that could lead to harm. But this is very challenging for companies. So many companies still have this view that, well, if they're not vocally taking sides or if they are apolitical, then they're neutral. They're not influencing the larger context. And that, of course, is untrue. They also haven't resourced to understand the context. So there's a real lack of know-how internally in terms of identifying local dynamics or being able to explain how the company is going to influence those. And then the other issue, and this starts getting into some of the structural constraints that companies are dealing with, the decision makers are typically at the corporate level, whereas the people who know those dynamics are on the ground. And this, again, this is very common in the INGO world, where again, we've spent decades working out the complementary role of HQ and local teams, but this is quite underdeveloped in the business world. And so the decision makers at the top don't always have a good grasp of local dynamics. They don't always understand the red flags, and there's not always the systems to make sure that they receive information that something's going south. So let me just sort of end the discussion of the constraints companies are facing by touching a bit more on some of these structural issues. So the last point I want to make is that companies, of course, are huge. And so because of their size, and just to give some examples, Microsoft has 160,000 employees, Cargill, 155,000 employees, and both of those companies are spread across tens of countries globally. These companies are very large, and because of their size, they need to cascade down decision-making frameworks in a very top-down manner. Most of these decision-making frameworks are grounded in a legal framework. It is not required that companies pay attention to context. It is required that they comply with regulation. So since there's not a legal requirement that they attend to context, they're often then very reluctant to play a role that they see as best played by the state. You have the huge size and complexity of these companies. You often have very fragmented decision-making. And in that mix, you have very small teams who are responsible for paying attention to the impact that the company might have on society. So often these are human rights teams or sustainability teams. Sometimes they're teams that are in functions related to risk and compliance, but those teams are typically under-resourced, very small, and they are struggling to figure out how to make change at an enormous company. So let me just end by talking a little bit about how civil society can engage with business on these issues. And this came up actually in the earlier conversation, kind of recognizing that this is a big ecosystem. And so what actually is the right role for civil society and the public sector? And I would argue that there's two key functions that civil society, the public sector should be playing. One is around raising awareness of the issue. So how is conflict emerging in the US? What are the dynamics driving this? And then what are the potential solutions? So civil society and government is best placed compared to business to do research on this, to develop some practical solutions. And then we need to find the right fora to socialize these. And that's probably going to look like some multi-stakeholder forums and collaborative initiatives. The second role that the public and civil sector should be playing is around shaping the enabling environment. So policymakers should be thinking about regulations that are going to change some of the incentives that companies have to respect human rights and to put, or maybe to stop putting profit over people. Civil society, of course, can play a very helpful role in terms of putting pressure on companies. So utilizing that research, not just to raise awareness amongst business, but to raise awareness amongst businesses, shareholders, and customers, because those actors can then apply pressure directly to the companies. So then we get to how civil society can actually engage with companies. And I just want to emphasize here that this is actually quite similar as in the development space. We need to be thinking about why companies are behaving as they do. We need to empower them to drive change internally, and we need to think about the language that they're going to understand. So step number one is really identifying the right people to engage. Companies aren't monolithic. There's a lot of competing incentives. We need to be identifying those who are making decisions about operations and those who are responsible for managing the risk to the business. So corporate philanthropy is often going to be a bit hived off. Again, that can be valuable for supporting specific civil society initiatives, but those actors are probably not going to be effective in changing the way the business operates. It's also really important to recognize that the people working on human rights and risk are your allies. So it seems strange, but many people who work with companies are very fearful of meeting with civil society because they're afraid they're going to get in the room and be criticized. And companies should be criticized. Specifically, their CEOs should be criticized. But the people working on risk and human rights are trying to drive the same change that all of us are. And they welcome the research and the pressure that you can put on their decision makers, because that gives them leverage internally to drive change. What they would want to hear from you is, what is some of this information? What are the scandals? What are the case studies? What are the negative consequences that I can take to my leadership in order to convince them that certain changes need to be made? Finally, I touched on this a little bit, but it's really important to speak the language that is going to resonate for companies. So the business and human rights language is a very useful one. It's also important to think about how to empower those internal company actors to manage those internally competing incentives. So how do you make the business case? Why should the company be taking steps to hire certain people or to avoid operating in a certain way? We have to be able to demonstrate why the cost will pay off in the long run and the short run. And then finally, it's often really important, because companies do operate within a legal framework, it's often important to start with compliance. Often people approach business and human rights with, well, companies should be doing the right thing, and they should be doing the right thing. But if we want to drive change, we need to be pragmatic. We need to understand their incentives, and we need to understand the levers that are going to enable them to make the changes that are necessary. So I know I went on far longer than you really gave me time for, but I will stop there, and of course, very happy to take any questions.
No, this was fantastic, Jenny. And when we were talking about this, whether it's in the US or globally, we have not done a good job of working with the private sector. And some of this is kind of a 101 for us. And starting that conversation, and you said it a bunch of times, so I'm going to repeat it. Meet them where corporations are. We're sitting in the same room. Alan, you said this the other day when we were talking, and we're saying the same thing, but we're not speaking the same language, and we're talking past each other. So I think that's one of the really important pieces you made. You also made some really good points. Well, you made lots of great points, but two really good points are working within the system of the corporation and also working outside. And we do that already with governments and donors. One day I'm in, talking with USAID, and advocating or up on the Hill, and then I'm writing about it and putting pressure on from the outside as well. So we have to do better that way of looking both inside and outside, but also learning the language and communicating. And I will just say that's one thing I strongly say the peacebuilding community is not great at. We tend to get stuck in our pure language and want to keep driving it home. So Alan, I'm going to turn to you next. JP Morgan is an incredibly large company. Your CEO and your company have put out some statements this year. You've also, when looking through your website, you have a statement, your company has a statement about the importance of civic education and understanding civics in the US. So talk to us a little bit about, how JP Morgan is fitting into this. And then also some of the things that Jenny talked about, advice to the peace building field about how we work better in this space.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks, Jenny. That was fascinating. So let me sort of start by just saying, as we look at this question of what role the private sector can and should play in addressing the causes that contribute to peace building or the causes that don't. The first thing I think we really need to do is understand where these incentives align, right? And I am in no way trying to say that incentives are always aligned, but I think that there is, if we look at the sort of Venn diagrams of the goals that peace builders are striving for, and some of the same goals that private sector has a deep-seated interest in, the sort of shaded area in between may be larger than some people realize. So I think, understanding those incentives is the first thing, and then also understanding the trends which are affecting those incentives right now. And there are several, and I think the last couple of years have really accelerated some of the trends that are affecting the way the corporations view themselves and view their own responsibility to the communities that they operate in. Those are changing, and right now they're trending in a way that should accommodate increased collaboration if we do it right, and if we're able to kind of meet in the middle, as Jenny was saying. So while I am not here to be a corporate apologist in any way, nor to in any way insinuate that corporations or private sector are doing enough, I think there's an opportunity, and I think that's one of the things that I want to talk about. So let me just start by saying, or prompting this idea that the private sector has always had a deep invested interest in stability. Jenny mentioned this too, but a company fundamentally benefits from things like a strong rule of law, comprehensive infrastructure, a free and open society, an absence of violence, strong political and financial institutions, a society which offers people the opportunity of upward mobility, a society that respects equality and equity along race and gender lines. Companies choose where to operate based off those things, and they are fundamental to the success or the failure of a company. Now, these are the same components that people, as we're talking about fragile states, those are a lot of the same elements, and I think that's important to notice. Historically, I think there's been a sense where a lot of those issues were being addressed by government. And as Neelan said in the first session, there's been a deep change in how people view government, how much they trust government, and people have changing views on what their role is on some of these issues. At the same time, they're having changing views of what the private sector's role are. And I think at the same time, as we've seen this rise of corporate responsibility, we've also seen that private sectors are starting to seek a voice on these issues and have an impact on these issues in the communities in which they operate. So I think there's a couple things happening. One is there's a realization that these elements can't be addressed by government alone, and that private sector has a vested interest in being part of the solution. And so I think, this this idea of yes, we have a vested interest is becoming more and more clear. I think the idea of we need to coordinate with both government and civil society is less clear, and that part's been less successful so far. I think another piece that I want to highlight here is, especially as we're looking at the trends, is this rethinking of what a corporation is and who it serves. So a corporation historically has been seen to serve shareholders principally and had a primary goal of increasing shareholder value. This was seen as a short-term goal. Companies report quarterly, and there was this kind of rat race to continually try and increase corporate profit, and to whatever ends that may be. There has been a shift, and in August of last year, the Business Roundtable actually came out and amended this definition of what a corporation is, so that to say we're not only corporations are not only beholden to shareholders, but they're also beholden to the employees of the corporation, to the suppliers of that corporation, to customers of that corporation, and to the communities that that corporation touches. And so that's actually that's a fairly significant shift. And I think at the same time, there's this push to change the time horizon at which shareholder value was evaluated. There's been a massive push to eradicate quarterly reporting, and to sort of say that we need to be investing in our people and in our communities in a way that affects long-term shareholder value, and that's a fundamentally different idea. And that the idea that a corporation cannot be successful unless the sort of long-term health of the communities in which they operate in is also being sort of fed. I think that's a new idea, and also sort of opens up the opportunity for corporations to be more and more involved in the kinds of issues and the kinds of causes that we're talking about. I think the last couple of years, there's also been a shift, and without being political, I think the Trump presidency changed thinking on some of these issues in many ways. Customers have increasingly been looking to, especially Main Street brands, or to have views on social issues. Customers were looking for a response after Charlottesville, and then especially in the last year, events, COVID, George Floyd, the events of January 6th, customers have looked to how companies have reacted, and there's a expectation of companies having a stance and not being a neutral player necessarily anymore. At the same time, I think companies are also looking at the last 12 months, increasingly aware of both how fragile the system is and how interconnected the system is. And so I think, I think it was Tim who was talking about how everyone was kind of hit at once, and the interconnectedness and the sort of fragility were both really highlighted in these last 12 months. And so companies have a vested interest really in the resiliency of the system. And as you pointed out, resiliency isn't always positive, and stability isn't always positive. But I do think that the interest in resiliency became that much more clear. So I'll just end by saying companies have this interest to build and sustain a stable community. I think there's a changing view in what that interest is, and also how to invest in that interest without betraying the sort of the inherent contract with the shareholder. And if we're able to really harness the private sector and get them to be part of the solution, I think there's a potential for some amazing collaborations and also innovation on these issues of bringing in an entirely new voice to this conversation.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you one question that we talked about yesterday briefly, because and Jenny mentioned it too, that do no harm, right? That understanding the context. And you said something really interesting when we were talking yesterday about the fact that we're starting to see that we have toxic polarization in the US, and we're splitting more, right? We're watching different TV shows, we're watching different news. And you said something about, almost in a sense, we have to be careful because, if companies, go one way or the other, and then, I'm only going to this bank, and these people are only going to this bank. And then obviously the employees will only go, they'll hire from that and hire from, and then, and we're creating another system of, pushing us farther apart.
Yeah. I think, it's an interesting dynamic. And I think a lot of companies and a lot of C-suite executives right now are grappling with this. If you look at something like Charlottesville or January 6th, that's fairly easy for a corporate or CEO to come out and denounce, right? I would view that as a fairly black and white situation. There are a lot of instances along the sort of full political spectrum that are happening where companies are having to choose whether or not to take a stand, whether or not to make a public outcry. And there is a risk to some of this. I mean, there is a risk in which corporations become increasingly tied to one end or the other of the political spectrum, and that's potentially, I don't know if it's dangerous, but it's potentially, I don't know if that's really the intention for most people, but there's a scenario at which you have Republicans only going to Home Depot and going to Equinox, and Democrats going to Lowe's, and Democrats going to JP Morgan, Republicans going to Wells Fargo, or only certain clothing brands, and this has all become more and more debated publicly as CEOs' political contributions become public, or as companies take certain stances. And there's an idea at which that identity gets wrapped up with a company's brand. I don't think that's necessarily anyone's goal. I mean, you do have like this sort of MyPillow guy who I think is made his sort of political stance way more tied up into his brand and seem to do so fairly willingly. But I think most corporations would try and avoid that. But I guess the point there is that it is a slippery slope. I think there is a demand for companies to take a stance and to have a moral or to have a point of view, and yet they also need to do so in a way that isn't fully alienating to their customer base.
Isn't fully alienating, and that's the whole point. Also, contributing to toxic polarization. Right. So that's anyway, when you said that yesterday to me, and I was thinking about it a lot. I thought it was really an important point that you brought up.
Can I just add one thing on that?
No, Angela, you step in. This is your time now.
I just want to add one thing. I think it's an interesting conundrum for corporate America to find itself in right now. And I also think we want to make sure that we're separating what companies are saying and what companies are doing, right? Because you can pay lip service to an issue, or brands can pay lip service to an issue. But I think it's also important to look at the way that they're doing business, which I think is what Alan touched on and Jenny touched on, and sort of like what are they doing within their own operations, or how are their product X, how is it made, and all sort of transparency. And we have seen an increased push on transparency around companies and the actions that the way that they're doing their business, the way they're conducting their business, how they're treating their employees, are they paying their employees equally, those types of things. So I think it's important also not just to look at like what's happening on Twitter, right?
No, but Angela, that's actually an excellent point too, because then you also have companies saying one thing, we're not going to contribute to political or elected leaders who didn't vote, who voted against certifying the election, and then you find out that they did. And so I think that's that's also the transparency. It's like, just be honest also about what you're doing. But it also goes back to Jenny's point. Companies are huge, right? So somebody might be doing that, didn't get the memo, and so thinking about that is that it's not, corporations are not a monolith. It's not a one size fits all. And I think that that's a really important piece. So Angela, this is kind of putting you into this. You come from the corporate social responsibility world at Qualcomm. Talk to us about that, and how you're thinking about these issues, and in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably I would echo a lot of what Alan said. So I don't want to be redundant, but I'll just give something that I haven't heard mentioned yet, which is that there is this field of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance. I mean, we've all talked about it, but I don't think anybody's named it yet. Which I have oversight of at Qualcomm as part of the corporate responsibility portfolio. And what that means basically is exactly what Jenny was saying, which is how a company does business. So whereas I think before philanthropy was off to the side, and I do think that there is a time and a place for that for companies in which to engage, I think now it is integrated across the business, and the tentacles of ESG are so far reaching. So it's not just, what are you doing for education programs for kids? It's also like, what is your commitment to human rights? And I saw somebody sent a chat around, like, do you think companies would make statements on peace building? And my answer would be yes. I think many companies have come out and made statements. As Jenny said, they call it a commitment to human rights. I don't know that I've seen the framing peace building. But at Qualcomm, we have a commitment to human rights. It's in line with the UN Global Compact. And many other sort of international organizations. We didn't just create it in a vacuum, right? We're looking at all of these guiding principles to ensure not just within our own operations, but also, human rights within our supply chain. And I think it's important to, as I was saying, sort of look at what a company is doing. This push for ESG has really ramped up transparency. And I think, Alan talked about how the statement on the purpose of a corporation from the Business Roundtable was sort of the first time that we've seen that switch from Milton Friedman in the 60s about what the purpose of a corporation was, right? And to look at how we have more than one set of stakeholders now, right? It's not just our shareholders, it's also our employees. I mean, Alan said this, it's also our supply chain, it's also policymakers, it's also customers, right? So, and a company like Qualcomm, who many of you may or may not have heard of, it's not a consumer brand, so you don't necessarily go out and buy Qualcomm tech, it's just in your phone or your IoT device or whatever. But I think it's important because large scale investors are pushing companies to be more transparent on these issues because people are pushing, and policymakers are pushing. So companies are going to end up there either way, whether they're being proactive or they're being reactive. But we're seeing it now, with the Biden administration, or let's take Europe from the European Commission, on issues like climate, on issues like diversity and inclusion. Some of that is, I think, responsive to certainly what happened last summer in the US and what continues to happen even just earlier this week, unfortunately. And I think we need civil society to help us, I think, in terms of looking at some of what are those issues. And I think Jenny was talking about, a lot of times company, I think you were saying we, or maybe Liz, you were saying this, we as in the peace building community are working with governments and donors, and companies are also working with those same entities, right? We are also working with governments. We're lobbying them, of course. We're also doing advocacy work maybe for other issues, but we're all talking to the same people. So I think it would be interesting to look at how we might be able to do that and work together. So for my portfolio, we have this environmental social governance. We also have a number of programs in the US and around the world for STEM education, for diversity and inclusion, for tech for good. So how is the tech we're building being leveraged for economic empowerment or democratization of digital, right? So we're reducing the digital divide. And we need civil society organizations to help us with that, right? Because I'm coming from a company, I'm not going to be an implementer. I'm not going to create those programs. I want to help you in the programs that you're doing what kind of tech solution might be helpful to you, but you tell me. I don't want to just give it to you. You know, I mean, I want you to tell me what you need, and then we can help find a solution mutually. And I think you've seen a lot of that. I think corporate responsibility over the last 10 years, what sort of started as philanthropy, then sort of came to corporate responsibility, and then it now has moved into ESG. It is integrated across the business. The C-suite is looking at it. The CFO is looking at it. I mean, I think those decision makers are in the room now, and they also want to hear from civil society as well. So I'll stop there, because I know like we only have about 10 minutes for questions, but I do think that it's an interesting, an interesting discussion point. And I would say, I'm not, like Jenny was saying, corporations are a little bit scared of civil society because they don't want to be called out or whatever. But I would say, like, I think corporations are welcoming that and want to be able to have those open, candid conversations, whether it's with the government or with civil society, about these really, really, really important issues.
That's a really important point, and I want to say that I want to thank you both for, well, all three of you for being here, because it is not easy to get corporations in the room with us, and a lot of times they say yes and then they pull out, and so I think that's something we also need to look inside ourselves and say why that is, and building more of that partnership, like we do with government. And being okay that, sometimes we have to say things that we don't, agree with, but being able to accept that risk on both sides a little bit. So, it's not an area that the field is comfortable in. So how do we get more comfortable with it? From the three of you, what's your best advice to this sector? And looking at it, again, it's also one way to look at it. You think about, I was just reading recently, it was H&M stopped, partly it was legal, stopped getting the cotton from the Uyghur region. Now they're facing a backlash from Chinese population within China. How do you, and so it's easier, I think, for corporations to look over there and do the right thing, but here in the United States, and this is not something that, I think you heard Tim and others, if you heard him say, we're struggling, it's our country, we're struggling, we're not neutral. So we're making lots of mistakes too. And, we are able to say in Srebrenica, you have to reconcile with your neighbor, but we don't want to do that here. So what's your best advice for getting us comfortable more with the corporate sector? And also how, and what do we do? What do you need from us?
I mean, I could offer one thing, and then if others want to jump in, I mean, I think, it's totally fine to criticize corporate America. I get that. And I as Alan, I think said, we're not doing everything perfectly, but I think it's also helpful to come with solutions. And so we are open, I think, to hearing about, things that you all are working on and programs that could be helpful. I know a lot of times, like, smaller organizations need funding. Certainly corporations have funding. I mean, we don't want to just write a check, but I think look at ways that we could work together that are of mutual interest, sort of in the way that Alan framed it. I think a lot of companies are looking to work in communities where they have an employee base. So if you're seeking out companies to work with, maybe an issue area that they're aligned with, whether it's through their sustainability programming, corporate responsibility, or whatever product they're building, and then looking at where they have employee bases in the US and starting there, whether it's their headquarters or where people are working. As opposed to just emailing and saying, wow, we really need funding for this program that is not tied to anything that you're doing, because I'm sure there's a company out there that fits. So I wouldn't just sort of send that email out cold, but I think it's good to sort of help, as Alan said, find mutual interest, because at the end of the day, we are still a corporation, and we also have to report up the chain about how it's tying into to our overall strategic efforts as well.
Yeah, I'd add to that and say, and this goes back to something that I think Jenny mentioned, and Liz as well, of there's a translation issue, partially, in that I think that civil society and the peace building world and corporate world, that gray area where the Venn diagram overlaps is more significant than people think, but we're using different language. And I do think it behooves civil society to translate their work into corporate speak at times. And frankly, because I think in some ways corporate speak is a little lazy to do the translation on their side. So, if I look at JP Morgan's efforts, both on the philanthropy side and in corporate social responsibility, they're tied to narrow issue areas that are aligned with the business. A lot of them have to do with economic empowerment, expanding economic opportunities. A lot of those are specifically then targeted on female entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs of color, expanding services to the extreme poor, so people that are entirely unbanked, and actually offering them a bridge sort of into the mainstream society. These are specific areas, and yet the overlying goal of them does factor into the same issues that we're talking about, right? They all do sort of work towards a more stable society if you look at them holistically. But I do think then that there needs to be in the approach to companies using that vernacular as opposed to maybe some of the vernacular of the peace building world. I think helps bridge that divide. Not to put the onus entirely on civil society, but in my experience, I think that would be helpful.
And you just raised a really good point. I know, Jenny, you want to say something, but I just wanted to say that we're constantly like, what's wrong, beating up. I mean, I had no idea that JP Morgan does this, right? So, Starbucks tells a really good story that they give healthcare, they pay for school, and also, but they promote it, it's part of their brand. And when it was the incident a couple years ago when they asked a Black man who was a customer waiting for somebody to come in to leave, I think that's why they were able to handle that better, because people did say, well, they give help, and this is what, again, company's not a monolith, So anyways, that's interesting.
Well, if you think through though, just like no, it's
okay, go ahead.
The stuff that I was saying before, again, if we're reframing long-term shareholder value, those efforts go towards expanding a possible customer base, right? Like advancing economic opportunity in the long term would help JP Morgan Chase. Yes, like that is actually us giving out hundreds of millions of dollars into programming, but we've been able to then sort of translate that and justify it through this kind of new way of thinking and this new definition of what expanding shareholder value is in a longer time horizon than we used to do. So, our efforts in these are theoretically or not theoretically self-serving in a long term, and yet they still get to the same underlying efforts that you're working on.
And promoting stability.
Stability,
right? Jenny, you're like ready to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to, make a bigger picture recommendation. Some of the recommendations I gave earlier were really around how might almost one-on-one civil society or policymakers engage companies. But if we're thinking about what the peace building community, policymakers and civil society and academics together, I think coordinated action is really critical. And the most important thing that the peace building community can do is find a way to jointly make the case to business leadership. So this means making sure that you're getting articles into Bloomberg, into the Financial Times, into conferences, being able to talk about, here's what's going on in the United States, here's what's driving it, here's what business should do. So simple message, 2 columns in the Financial Times, every CEO is going to read it. Like that, nothing unlocks change at a company like the CEO taking a decision, because then it cascades down. Otherwise, we're working piecemeal, trying to get somebody with a human rights role to embed it across the company. But if we can really raise the awareness of business leadership, that's going to make that change happen a lot faster. And
oh,
there
hey,
are
wait,
numerous...
that's an idea. Actually, again, you've all said it, go meet in the middle. You mean write an article in Bloomberg? Like, it never even occurred to me to send them an article, or,
right.
Oh, go to a business conference? Ew, right?
Well, and there's numerous business associations that can be engaged. So the Business Roundtable, for example, has been very proactive about advocating for, you know, different kinds of actions that are outside of just business alone. So being able to, you know, having them as a partner and being able to present a united front rather than just a bunch of different civil society organizations approaching them, I think would be the way to go.
Okay, that was pretty brilliant. A couple of questions have come in. Julia, I just want to point out, Julia talked about the translation of our programs and also share our impact. Partnering with corporations requires metrics of value for good, money to end this good storytelling. And that's, I wrote back to her and said, yeah, and Starbucks tells a great story, right? They have a great narrative. And somebody wrote, we in the NGO space need to really hear what Angela and Alan just said about the changes that are going on in the corporate world. Because, you know, I think we haven't adapted our thinking about corporations. We think of them as like kind of good or bad or not doing anything, and not understanding that. So, I mean, I can't even tell you how many amazing points came out of this. I'm going through the questions really quickly to just see. Jenny, somebody asked, or Nathan asked, how might the UN guiding principles, did you see that question?
I did, and I you know, there are some specific principles that can be referenced from the UN guiding principles. The UN guiding principles state, first off, that government is responsible for ensuring, you know, for promoting and protecting human rights. And companies should be able to rely upon their governments to ensure that. And there's a few other specific principles as well that can be referenced. So Principle 23, for example, states that where states insufficiently protect human rights, companies are actually expected to seek ways to honor the principles of internationally recognized human rights. So around political participation, for example. So there are a few specific principles that could be referenced. I'm happy to have follow-up conversation with anybody about these issues as well. So, you know, you can find my email address in my bio that I know is on the webpage for this event, and feel free to drop me a line and I'm happy to talk further.
Well, I just want to ask Angela, Alan, do you guys have any final thoughts? This was the beginning of this conversation. This is not the end of it. And so I know I've you know, been taking notes feverishly as well to do a lot of follow-up. So Alan, Angela, any final comments?
I'll just say I've now been affiliated with AFP for going on 18 months. And I think part of and we've been having this conversation since I started of like how to better communicate. And so I continue to sort of say the same thing, which is I think that there is a real tangible opportunity, and yet I'm not sure I have the answer yet of how to bridge that divide. And so, I think it's going to take some hard work and some, the same things that we're talking about, meeting in the middle, trying to sort of speak each other's language, put the impact into the metrics, as Julia said in the chat, into the metrics that business understands. I think storytelling is an excellent point. Like actually case studies, sort of being able to present a case study and say, this is what we're doing. And I think all of those things help. But, I maintain that there is a huge opportunity, and the trends are going in a direction where that opportunity should be getting larger. And so I look forward to trying to be part of that.
Thank you, Alan. And you're a great board member trying to help us translate this. Angela, is there anything, or Jenny, any final thoughts?
I'll just say, I think this is a great first conversation. I look forward to more. I think sort of echo what Alan said, and I think It's not going to be solved in one big thing. It's going to be sort of an iterative process. But I do think between government and civil society and corporations, like that, those are the actors that we need to sort of find the secret sauce.
Awesome. All right. I want to thank you guys so much. This has been phenomenal. And I want to thank everybody out there who's been watching. This has been recorded and it will be shared. But thank you so much. And like I said, it's not the end. It's just the beginning of this, of the hard work that we need to do in this sector. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our participants too.